The morning sun rose gently over the rolling hills of Andalusia, painting the rooftops of the village in soft golden light. The town of San Miguel was alive before the rooster even crowed. From narrow cobblestone streets came the hum of excited voices, the clatter of pots and pans, and the faint sound of guitars being tuned in anticipation. It wasn't just another day. It was a day written in the Benitez family history, a day they had been preparing for months. Two siblings, Lucia and Mateo Benitez, were to be married on the very same day, not in two ceremonies, not in two different churches, but together, sharing the altar, the guests, and the joy. The people of San Miguel couldn't remember the last time they had seen such a celebration. A double wedding was rare, and when it happened, it was a feast for the entire town. Inside the modest Benitez household, the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasted almonds, and lavender flowers gathered from the fields. Relatives bustled about like bees around a hive. The women tied ribbons, polished heirloom jewelry, and prepared trays of food. The men fetched wine barrels and hung garlands of olive branches along the walls. The children, died with excitement, ran through the halls carrying baskets of petals for the brides. Every person, whether blood relative or neighbor, had a role to play. The family's matriarch, Dona Rosa, stood in the middle of the whirlwind, her hands folded in front of her chest as she watched with misty eyes. Her children were starting their new lives, and she felt the weight of both pride and nostalgia. "This is how life should be," she whispered to her sister, laughter, unity, and blessings under God's sky. The brides and grooms were dressed with a blend of tradition and youthful style. Lucia wore her grandmother's lace veil, carefully preserved for 3 generations, and her fiancé, Alvaro, wore a dark suit stitched by his uncle. Mateo, the younger brother, stood tall and proud, his nerves hidden behind a smile. His bride, Sofia, carried white lilies tied with a ribbon her mother had given her that morning, whispering, "These flowers are a symbol of purity and strength. May they guide your marriage." By mid-morning, the streets were lined with villagers, clapping and cheering as the family made their way to the church. Bells rang from the old stone tower, echoing across the valley. Musicians played guitars and tambourines, their songs blending with the sound of children laughing and vendors offering sweets to the crowd. The air itself felt alive with promise. Inside the church, the pews were overflowing. Friends, neighbors, farmers, merchants, all came to witness the union. Some came for the free food and wine that would follow, but most came because the Benitez family had always been kind, generous, and respected. To them, this was not just a wedding, it was a symbol of community, of togetherness. As the ceremony began, the brides walked down the aisle side by side, two sisters in heart, if not by blood, beginning their journey into new families yet tied forever through love. The grooms stood waiting, eyes wide with both excitement and nerves, as though time itself had paused to watch them. When the priest raised his hands to bless the couples, the room seemed to glow. Words of sacred vows floated through the air like music, promising faithfulness, strength, and a future built together. The first kiss was followed by thunderous applause. Rice was thrown, bells chimed again, and tears of joy fell freely from eyes both young and old. It was, for all who stood there, a reminder that love still had the power to unite people, no matter how divided the world seemed beyond the village. The reception hall was already prepared, decorated with strings of lanterns and flowers picked from nearby gardens. Long wooden tables were covered with plates of roasted lamb, olives, cheeses, and baskets of warm bread. Pitchers of wine stood ready to be poured, and cakes, layered high and covered with sugar flowers, waited to be cut. There would be dancing, laughter, and the kind of music that carried late into the night. For a moment, everything was perfect. The mothers clasped hands as they watched their children laugh. Fathers exchanged proud glances as if silently telling one another, "We did it. We raised them well." The siblings hugged, teasing each other about who would have more children first, and the village. Oh, the village was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Strangers became friends, friends became family, and joy flowed through the streets like wine from an endless cup. Yet, hidden beneath this sea of happiness was a truth that no one could see. Life, unpredictable and fragile, was preparing to strike in ways no one expected. That's the danger of joy. It makes us believe that nothing can go wrong, that tomorrow is guaranteed. But for now, on this radiant morning, the Benitez family knew only laughter. They knew only hope. They believed they were living one of the happiest days their family would ever see. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that we never know when life will turn, which is why we must soak in every smile, every embrace, and every fleeting moment of love as if it were the last. Because even when tragedy waits around the corner, joy real, pure joy remains untouchable in memory. That day, the Benitez family lived joy in its truest form. A joy so powerful, it would carry them even through the storm that was about to arrive. In the Benitez household, tradition was not just a word, it was the air they breathed. Their lives were built on rituals passed down like sacred treasures, each one carrying the voices of ancestors long gone. Every wedding, every baptism, every burial in San Miguel was shaped by the weight of these customs. And on this day, when two children of the family were to be wed, those traditions felt heavier, yet more beautiful than ever before. Dona Rosa, the mother of the bride and groom, believed that without tradition, families lost their roots. She often said, when we forget where we come from, we lose who we are. To her, a wedding wasn't just two people joining in love. It was generations whispering their blessings across time. The Benitez family carried those whispers carefully, weaving them into every detail of the ceremony. From the earliest hours of the morning, tradition guided every hand and every heart. The women gathered in the kitchen, their aprons dusted with flour, as they prepared almond pastries and honey cakes that had been served in the family for nearly 100 years. The recipes weren't written on paper, they lived in memory, in the way an elder's hand measured sugar by sight, not by spoons, or how a pinch of cinnamon was added with a silent nod to the past. The men carried out their own rituals. Before sunrise, the fathers and uncles walked together to the vineyards, gathering bottles of last season's wine, which had been stored precisely for this occasion. Wine in their culture wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of life, of blood, of shared strength. As they carried the bottles back, one uncle remarked, "This wine was made with the sweat of our forefathers. Today, it will bless the lips of the next generation." Even the clothing was heavy with meaning. Lucia's lace veil was not merely a piece of fabric. It had been worn by her grandmother and great-grandmother, both of whom had lived through wars and poverty yet never abandoned faith in love. When Lucia placed it over her head, she felt as if their courage and endurance were draped upon her shoulders. Mateo, her brother, wore cufflinks that belonged to his late grandfather, a man remembered for his honesty and strength. As he fastened them, he whispered a silent prayer, "May I carry your name with honor." Tradition also shaped the ceremony itself. In San Miguel, it was customary for the brides and grooms to walk through the village before reaching the church, accompanied by music and the cheers of neighbors. It was not simply a procession. It was a declaration that marriage was not just between two people, but between families, between the community, between heaven and earth. Children scattered petals along the cobblestones, elders stood at their doors to bless the couples, and even the poorest villagers offered tokens of goodwill, a loaf of bread, a bouquet of wildflowers, a whispered prayer. When the families arrived at the church, the weight of tradition grew even more visible. The priest, Father Esteban, reminded everyone that marriage was not to be taken lightly. He spoke of commitment, of sacrifice, of the sacred bond that outlived hardship. "In joy you will celebrate together," he said. "In sorrow you will stand together. What you promise here is not just for today, but for every day that follows until death parts you." His words echoed through the ancient stone walls, the same walls that had witnessed countless weddings before this one. Yet, beneath the beauty of these traditions, there was also an invisible pressure. For the Benitez family, everything had to be perfect. Every detail had to honor the ancestors. Every ritual had to be fulfilled without flaw. To break tradition was to risk shame, not only for the couple, but for the entire family name. The elders whispered reminders, "Don't forget the ribbon of lilies at the altar. Make sure the bread is blessed before it is broken. The brides must not see each other before the procession begins. The younger generation sometimes felt suffocated by these expectations. Matteo once confessed to his sister, "What if I don't live up to all of this? What if I fail?" Lucia smiled softly and replied, "Tradition isn't about perfection. It's about remembering we're not alone. When we walk into that church, we carry them, all of them, with us. That's what gives us strength." And indeed, when the vows were spoken, the weight of tradition did not crush them. It lifted them. The grooms felt braver, the brides felt steadier, and the family felt united. In that moment, they weren't just individuals. They were branches of a tree rooted deeply in the soil of history. Still, what no one realized was how fragile this balance truly was. Tradition could give strength, but it could not shield them from life's storms. It could guide, but it could not control fate. The Benitez family, wrapped in the embrace of rituals and customs, believed they had built an unshakable day. Yet destiny was waiting just around the corner, ready to remind them that no matter how strong the weight of tradition, life itself holds the final word. And that is the lesson hidden within their story. Traditions are powerful, but they are not invincible. They connect us to those who came before, but they cannot promise us tomorrow. They can make our joy sweeter, our love stronger, and our family closer. But they cannot prevent sorrow from arriving uninvited. For the Benitez family, tradition gave meaning to the wedding. It bound them together in love and unity. But in just a few hours, they would learn that even the strongest traditions cannot shield the heart from the unexpected. The bells of San Miguel rang louder than they had in years, their metallic voices announcing not one, but two sacred unions. The villagers cheered as the brides and grooms stepped out of the church, their hands entwined, their faces glowing with the warmth of vows freshly spoken. Rice rained down upon them, laughter burst from every corner, and for a moment life felt untouchable. The carriages waited outside, decorated with ribbons and flowers, their wheels polished to gleam under the Andalusian sun. The plan was simple: escort the families and bridal parties to the reception hall, where music and feasting awaited. The horses, restless yet magnificent, pawed at the cobblestones as if sensing the excitement around them. Children clapped, old women crossed themselves, and the couples climbed aboard, still trembling from the sacred promises they had exchanged just minutes earlier. But joy, no matter how radiant, often casts the darkest shadows. As the first carriage rolled forward, carrying Lucia and her new husband, Alvaro, cheers filled the air. Behind them, Matteo and his bride, Sofia, climbed into the second carriage. The horses snorted, their nostrils flaring. The driver gave the reins a gentle shake, urging them forward. At first, all was well, until a sudden, sharp noise split the air. Some said it was the crack of a bottle dropped on the cobblestone. Others believed it was the distant thunder rolling off the hills. Whatever it was, it startled the horses. Their calm steps turned frantic. They reared and bolted, their eyes wide with panic. The carriage swayed violently as the driver tried to regain control, his shouts drowned by the chaos. Gasps turned into screams as the wooden wheels struck the edge of the cobblestone curb. The entire village froze, watching in horror as the second carriage lurched sideways. Sofia clutched Matteo's arm, her wedding bouquet falling to the ground. Within seconds, the carriage tipped, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the square. The horses dragged it several feet before it crashed violently, sending shards of wood flying and bodies tumbling onto the street. The music stopped, the laughter stopped, silence fell, broken only by cries of terror. Villagers rushed forward, hands trembling, hearts pounding. Lucia's carriage screeched to a halt as Alvaro leapt down, sprinting toward his brother. Dust and petals filled the air, mingling in a haunting dance that no one would ever forget. When they reached the wreckage, the sight was unbearable. Matteo lay unconscious, blood trickling from his head. His bride, Sofia, was sobbing, her white dress torn and stained, her trembling hands desperately trying to lift him. "Please, someone help. Please, he's not breathing," she screamed, her voice piercing the stunned crowd. Men lifted the broken pieces of the carriage, women brought cloth to stop the bleeding, and the priest who had just blessed the couple moments ago was now kneeling beside them, whispering prayers of mercy. But fate was unyielding. Despite desperate attempts to revive him, Mateo's chest never rose again. His life, so full of promise, had been stolen within the very hour he had promised to begin anew. The village square, decorated for joy, had become the stage of devastation. Children who had been scattering petals now clung to their mothers, terrified by the cries of anguish. The bread and wine, prepared for celebration, felt bitter in the mouths of those who watched a young bride's dream shatter before their eyes. Sophia collapsed beside her husband's still body, clutching his hand, refusing to let go. "You can't leave me, not today, not like this," she whispered, her tears soaking his blood-stained shirt. Her veil, once a crown of beauty, now lay crumpled in the dirt. Dona Rosa, the mother of both the bride and groom, was inconsolable. She fell to her knees, her wails echoing across the square. Minutes earlier, she had proudly watched her son walk down the aisle, cufflinks gleaming with the memory of his grandfather. Now she pressed her hands against his lifeless chest, begging God to undo what had been done. The villagers wept openly. Some blamed the horses, others called it the cruelty of fate, but no explanation could soften the blow. A wedding day had turned into a funeral procession. The church bells, which had rung with joy, now felt like cruel mockery. Even Alvaro, the surviving groom, stood motionless. His arm around his sister, Lucia, who sobbed uncontrollably, he stared blankly at the scene, whispering, "It could have been us, it could have been me." Survivor's guilt set in before the dust had even settled. The reception hall sat waiting, tables laden with food and wine, lanterns swaying gently in the breeze, but no one entered, no one sang, no one laughed. Instead, the villagers carried Mateo's body back into the church, the same church that had declared him a husband only an hour before. Candles were lit, not for celebration, but for mourning. The contrast was unbearable. On the altar, 2 marriage certificates lay side by side. One spoke of a union blessed and alive. The other, already shadowed, spoke of a marriage cut short before it had even begun. And this is how tragedy works. It doesn't knock politely. It doesn't wait until the feast is done or the song is over. It intrudes violently, reminding us of how fragile life is. The villagers would later say they had never experienced such whiplash of emotions, such a cruel blending of joy and despair. Some questioned their faith, others held tighter to it, but all agreed on one thing: they would never forget the day the Benitez weddings turned into a funeral. For Sophia, the bride whose husband never made it to their first dance, the pain became a lifelong companion. She would later tell others that the tragedy taught her one thing: that we must cherish the moments given to us, because sometimes life does not grant us the luxury of later. The somber truth of that day was carved into the memory of the entire town. Happiness can vanish in the blink of an eye, and tragedy does not wait for tomorrow. It comes when it wills, sometimes even on the very day you are meant to celebrate forever. The church that had only hours earlier echoed with music and laughter now carried a suffocating silence. The same stone walls that had heard vows of eternal love now bore witness to the cries of heartbreak. The Benitez family sat in shock, their eyes swollen from tears, their hearts fractured in ways that words could not mend. Grief had descended suddenly, violently, and without mercy. Mateo's lifeless body lay in the front of the church, draped in a white cloth hastily prepared by the village women. His bride, Sophia, knelt beside him, clutching his hand as if her love could somehow pull him back into the world of the living. Only hours earlier, she had promised to stand by him in sickness and in health, till death do them part. But death had come too soon, so soon that the vows felt unfinished, stolen before they could even begin to bloom. The guests didn't know how to act. They had dressed for a wedding, not a funeral. Some stood awkwardly, holding flowers meant for celebration, now unsure whether to place them at the altar or at the coffin being prepared. Others whispered questions no one dared answer. Do we continue with the feast? Do we cancel everything? How do we celebrate one union while mourning the loss of another? It was a paradox too heavy for the human heart, the collision of joy and sorrow in the same breath. Dona Rosa, the mother of the bride and groom, sat motionless in the front pew, her face pale and blank. She had lived through hardships before, poverty, illness, the loss of relatives, but nothing compared to this. To dress her son for his wedding in the morning, only to prepare his body for burial in the evening, was a cruelty too great to comprehend. Her hands trembled as she held her rosary, whispering prayers through her sobs. "God, take me instead. Spare my child." Beside her, Lucia, the surviving bride, sobbed uncontrollably into her husband Alvaro's arms. She too had exchanged vows that morning, but how could she rejoice when her brother lay dead? She felt guilt instead of happiness, sorrow instead of peace. Her wedding ring felt heavier than iron, a reminder that while her marriage had begun, her brother's had ended before it even started. The villagers mourned as though Matteo were their own. In small towns, grief spreads like fire. When one suffers, all suffer. Some wept openly, others stood in silent disbelief. The musicians who had tuned their guitars for the night's dancing now sat in the corner, instruments untouched, their hands unwilling to play songs of joy in the midst of despair. And Sophia, poor Sophia, was inconsolable. Her white gown, stained with dust and blood, seemed a cruel mockery of the happiness it was meant to symbolize. Her cries filled the church, shaking even the hardest of hearts. "Why, God, why today, why us?" she sobbed. There was no answer, only silence, heavy and unrelenting. Grief is strange. It does not follow rules. It does not arrive in neat stages. It crashes like a wave, unpredictable and merciless, leaving its victims gasping for breath. In the hours after the tragedy, the Benitez family felt it in every form: shock, anger, despair, guilt, disbelief. Some shouted at the heavens, others withdrew into silence. Some sought comfort in prayer, while others questioned their very faith. But beneath all this, a truth began to stir. As heavy as grief was, it was also a mirror. It showed the family in raw and painful clarity just how deep their love ran. The tears were not signs of weakness, but of connection. The cries were not signs of defeat, but of love unwilling to let go. That night, instead of a wedding feast, the family sat together in a circle of silence. Plates of food remained untouched, wine remained unpoured. No one danced. Instead, they held hands, clinging to one another as though the very act of togetherness could keep them from falling apart completely. One of the elders finally broke the silence. With a trembling voice, he said, "Grief does not mean the absence of love. It is love stretched beyond the borders of life. What we feel now is proof of what Matteo meant to us and what he will always mean." Those words pierced the darkness like a fragile light. Sophia, though shattered, lifted her head. She realized that grief, as crushing as it was, did not erase her marriage. Though it lasted only a single day, her love for Matteo would outlive the years they never had. Their union had been real, sacred, and eternal, even if the world had cut it short. In that realization, the family found the strength to endure. They began to see that grief, while painful, was not their enemy. It was the final act of love, the proof that Matteo had lived, had loved, and had been loved deeply in return. Over the next days, the grief remained heavy, but it shifted. Tears gave way to stories. Pain gave way to remembrance. The Benitez family told tales of Matteo's laughter, his kindness, his dreams for the future. They remembered the way he had smiled at Sophia during their vows, the way he had kissed his mother's forehead that morning, the way he had teased his sister as they lined up for the procession. These memories, fragile yet powerful, became their refuge. Grief had broken them, yes, but it had also bound them together, and that is the paradox of grief. It feels like the end, but it can also be the beginning. The beginning of deeper compassion, of stronger bonds, of a clearer understanding of how fleeting life truly is. The Benitez family, weighed down by sorrow, slowly began to realize that grief was not just a burden. It was a teacher. It taught them to cherish what remains, to hold tighter to one another, to live with urgency, knowing that tomorrow is never promised. Grief had taken their son, their brother, their groom, but it had also carved into their souls a truth that no joy could ever teach, that love, when tested by loss, becomes eternal. Time moved differently for the Benitez family after the tragedy. Days blurred into nights, and nights felt endless. The echoes of laughter from the wedding morning seemed like memories from another lifetime. Where there had once been joy, there was now a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sobs of Sophia, the young bride who had become a widow in the span of a single day. The village of San Miguel mourned with them, but grief is not something a community can carry away. It lingers, it digs deep, and it demands to be felt. For the Benitez family, every corner of their home became a reminder. Mateo's chair sat empty at the dinner table. His cufflinks, still polished from the wedding, lay untouched on the dresser. The suit he had worn, ripped in the accident, was carefully folded, as though one day he might need it again. At first, the family tried to silence their pain. They told themselves to be strong, to move on quickly, to carry the weight quietly. But grief is not a burden you can rush past. It is a road you must walk, one step at a time. And with each step, it began to carve lessons into their hearts. Lessons that would change not just their family, but generations after them. The first lesson came painfully clear. Life is fragile as a thread of silk in the wind. One moment Mateo had been smiling, kissing his bride, embracing his sister. The next he was gone. No illness had warned them, no signs had prepared them. Death had come like a thief in broad daylight. For Sofia, this lesson became her guiding truth. She stopped postponing her words of love. She stopped waiting for the right moment to say what she felt. She would later tell the young women of the village, if you love someone, say it today. If you need to forgive, forgive today. Tomorrow is not ours to hold. Her pain had taught her what many never learn until it's too late, that every heartbeat is borrowed time. The second lesson was about grief itself. At first, the family saw grief as an enemy, something cruel that had stolen their joy, but slowly they began to see grief for what it truly was, love stretched into sorrow. The reason the pain was so unbearable was because the love had been so deep. Lucia, who had struggled with guilt for being married on the same day her brother died, finally realized that her tears were not signs of betrayal to her own happiness, but proof of how much she loved her brother. The family came to understand that grief does not mean forgetting. It means remembering so fiercely that the heart aches under the weight of it, and that was okay. The third lesson was that no one can carry pain alone. In the days after the tragedy, family members tried to grieve privately, hiding their tears so as not to burden each other, but that only deepened the silence in the house. It was Sofia, broken yet courageous, who one evening said, "If we cry together. If we remember him together. Alone, we cannot survive this." From that night onward, they shared their grief. They ate together, prayed together, wept together. Slowly, the heaviness became bearable, not because it disappeared, but because it was shared. As weeks turned into months, Sofia's role shifted. Though she was young, she became a voice of wisdom in the community. She visited brides preparing for their weddings, not to bring fear, but to remind them of what truly mattered. "Don't waste time on flowers and dresses alone," she would say. "Spend time preparing your hearts, your faith, your commitment. Marriage is not about the perfection of the day, it's about the strength of the journey." Her tragedy gave her a mission, to turn her pain into purpose, to ensure that others would cherish the life and love they had while they still had it. What could have destroyed her instead made her a pillar of strength. The family's faith was shaken, perhaps more than anything else. Some asked, where was God that day? How could he allow such cruelty? Doubt crept in like a shadow, but in time they began to see faith differently. They realized faith was not a shield against suffering. It was the strength to endure suffering. Dona Rosa would tell her grandchildren, "God did not abandon us. He wept with us, and he gave us the strength to rise again." This perspective, carved from pain, gave them a faith more resilient than before, one rooted not in comfort but in trust through storms. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this: love does not die when a person dies. Mateo was gone, yes, but his love remained, in Sofia's tears, in his mother's prayers, in the stories his sister told, in the community's memory. Love had been transformed, not erased. That realization carried them forward. They began to celebrate Mateo's birthday, not with sorrow, but with remembrance. They spoke of him freely, not hiding his name in fear of reopening wounds. In time, the Benitez family realized that death may silence a voice, but it cannot silence love. The tragedy had carved pain into the deepest parts of their hearts, but it had also carved wisdom. They emerged not the same as before. How could they be, but with truths they might never have learned without the fire they endured? And so, the story of the Benitez family became more than a tale of loss. It became a living testimony. People in the village would tell their children, do not waste time, do not take love for granted. Remember the wedding that turned into a funeral and let it teach you how to live. Pain had carved lessons into their souls, lessons that hurt, yes, but lessons that would outlast grief, outlast tragedy, and carry forward into every new generation. Full story message. The story of the Benitez family reminds us all, life is unpredictable. We must cherish loved ones today, not tomorrow. Pain can be transformed into purpose. Love, when tested, becomes eternal.